state entities suing the state to get state money for them. And meanwhile, some outside law firm that's profiting on all of it. When you actually graph it out, it doesn't make any sense.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to The Narrative. Mike Andrews and Aaron Baer with you today. It's a special Going Deeper episode of The Narrative as we want to cover the topic of school choice. It's not something that we've gone into at great depth, but Aaron, you and I have had some conversations with David Mahan lately just about things that are in the air and some stats that are floating around. And so we wanted to bring in a panel of experts to really just debunk some of these things or to get better information out there for our listeners. And so we're joined by our friend Troy McIntosh, the executive director of the Ohio Christian Education Network. We've also got Rabbi Yitz Frank, who serves as the president of School Choice Ohio, and Aaron Churchill, who's the Ohio research director for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And it's going to be a great conversation today. We're excited to offer this to our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, they're really, I mean, with these three guys in particular, there's no one that really understands Ohio policy better than these three guys. But also, too, just dealing with the general misinformation you see coming out. And especially since Ohio's gone universal with the voucher, you've seen what's very clearly an orchestrated effort, both from the hard left publications like Ohio Capital Journal and the teachers unions, but also the Plain Dealer has been pushing out a number of really misleading articles and things like that. So we thought this would be a good time to really dive deeper on this topic and expose the truth of what's actually going on with school choice, not just in Ohio, but in America today.
Yeah, so we're going to treat this kind of as a roundtable. So gentlemen, as you feel led, please jump in and offer any data or your expertise as we have this conversation. And I think where I'd like to start is maybe the biggest overall false claim that's being made is that Ohio once had this just top 5 education system, public education system in the nation as recently as 20 years ago. We expand all this private school choice options and everything went to pot. And now we're very middle of the pack. Troy, can you tell us, are those numbers true or how are they making that assertion?
Well, as you'll see in so many of these cases where school choice opponents attempt to use data, they'll cherry pick data. And they'll use data that don't necessarily correlate one to the other, and then they'll try and throw it into the same bag and make comparisons. In the commonly used critique of school choice, they will argue that as recently as 20 years ago, Ohio was the 5th ranked state in the country in education, and now we're in the mid-20s. And again, this is a classic case of cherry-picked data, because if you go back and you look at school rankings from 20 years ago, state-by-state rankings, they are universally placing Ohio 20 years ago anywhere from 21 to 27. So they found this one ranking that uses whatever criteria it was using to show Ohio placed 5th, when that was not the consensus of where Ohio ranked in the state. As a matter of fact, if you look at sort of consensus rankings, you could argue that Ohio has improved its ranking since the ed choice and school choice expansions in Ohio. So you just need to be really careful when you're listening to anybody, really, but to make sure you understand the data that's being used. And I think we can share today some data that offers a lot of counterpoints to what you're going to hear from a lot of the critics.
So, Aaron Churchill, what is the real story there? What is the real narrative on where Ohio has been and where we are today?
Yeah, no, I agree with Troy in terms of the cherry picking. They picked one year where it was a ranking by a national publication called Ed Week, where it ranked Ohio high on their rating system, which included a number of inputs, like teacher salaries, and it also looked at national test scores in that year. It also looked at our standards and accountability system, which at that time was pretty strong. Ed Week actually changed their whole ranking system almost immediately after that ranking of Ohio. And so Ohio changed their ranking, strictly because of the way they changed their rubric. So that's where, Ohio on EdWeek's publication ranking falls more in 15th, 20th place in the nation. When we look at national test scores, what probably matters most is whether kids are learning and achieving, the type of reading and math standards that we really care about. Ohio has been very consistent over the past decade and a half on national assessments. There's a test that that assesses kids in every single state, a representative sample. And Ohio has been ranked consistently between 10th and 20th on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. In some grades and subjects, you'll see upticks, downticks from year to year. Some of that is a little bit of noise, but consistently, Ohio has been between 10th and 20th on our best measure of where kids are in terms of math and reading achievement. I think that's the standard that Ohio should be looking at, not a national publication that's looking at other variables, even looks at like adult earnings and those kind of things that have nothing to do with the K-12 education system. But in terms of achievement, Ohio has been somewhere between consistently 10th and 20th in the nation on math and reading scores. I think that's something Ohioans can be, pretty proud of. I mean, we can work to do better. That's what, we do at all of our organizations, try to improve our schools, public, private, public charter schools, and we want to see kids improve their achievement. We want to be at the top of the rankings, but it's not true that our rankings have fallen precipitously over the past 10 to 15 years.
So,
Aaron, well, it's even more than that. Like, sorry, not to cut you off, but there's obviously a lot to talk about on this subject, but one of those critiques that Troy brought up and that Aaron sort of fact checked, right? It sort of feeds into this narrative that we're doing something wrong here. That expanding school choice, our opponents say, actually cause these pretend academic declines, which, like Aaron said, that those are actually just not even true. But we do have a few studies on ed choice, and there was one study that came out, I don't know, around 10 years ago. It was actually sponsored by the organization that Aaron works for, which actually did find, at least at the time, the program was very small, that the scholarship students themselves seem to have a slightly negative academic. The results on their state standardized tests were slightly less than were in the public schools from which they came from. And so our opponents often hold that out and say, look, wow, vouchers are bad. Look at what's happening. But what they don't tell you is that the same study actually found that the creation of the voucher program and its application to that area actually increased test scores in those impacted public schools, right? So the only data that we have, only rigorous studies that we have, we can argue about other things, but it actually seems to show that these programs had a positive academic impact on our public school students, and that finding has been found in a number of other states that have studied this as well.
So, why do you think that is? I mean, that's the big question. Why would choice improve the public school outcomes?
Well, I think that, and Aaron can speak to this with much more of a analytical data scientist type hat, but I think that one of the things that us in the school choice movement and many of the legislators that historically have supported these programs have felt that, we view school choice, right, as basically a civil rights issue, right? Your child should have the same opportunity as anybody else's, right? And you should not be forced to go to a particular school because of a particular address that your parents happen to live in, right? And so education is that great equalizer. But one of the other things that choice does is it has what we call competitive effects, right? If all of a sudden you're told that you can go wherever you want, and so let's say that public school that was used to just, hey, if you live in our area, you're coming to us, the state's sending us money for you, and you have to be here. And all of a sudden, those parents have a choice. Well, what do you think those schools are going to do to keep those kids from coming back? They're going to do what they can to improve. Maybe they'll do more marketing. Maybe they'll improve their academics. Maybe they'll build a giant sports field. Whatever they need to do to get people to come really shop at their store, they're going to do. And I think what we've seen is some of that has led to improvements academically.
Just to touch on that a little bit more, there have been at least 28 independent studies done that look at the impact of school choice programs on the students who choose to remain in public schools. So these weren't studies that looked at the impact on the students who accepted the scholarship. They wanted to know what impact was it having on the students who chose not to use the program and remain in their public schools. Of those 28, 2 of them found a neutral impact. The other 26 found a positive impact on the academic performance of kids who chose to remain in public schools. So this narrative that critics use that say this is going to gut public schools, that's where the majority of our students attend, why would we be doing this? Actually, the argument is counter that. It's if you want to serve those students in the best possible way, then you ought to open up the market and the choice to everybody, including them, and then let everybody choose which school and which educational option serves them the best. And one of those studies actually was here in Ohio, and it was one done more recently by Aaron's group, Fordham, by Dr. Stefan Levertu at Ohio State, that looked specifically at Ohio's Ed Choice program. And they found a positive impact on Ohio's public school students.
And just for the record, every time we say Aaron and it sounds like something that's really smart, they mean Aaron Churchill, not Baer, right? The smart stuff is.
Did that need to be said?
That's if anybody was wondering that. I want to make that clear. I'll just say that there's a part of this just experientially, especially talking with public school advocates. One of the main things they'll talk about all the time is how, we need parents more engaged. We need parents more involved. And that's just one of the many benefits of school choice here is that you're actually, what we're seeing a lot in public education is almost this view. And again, I'll hear this from folks in public education that they treat public schools like daycare because you're assigned to this district. This is just where you send your kid, almost like set it and forget it. Right. But when you bring choice to the equation, you bring options to the equation, and you're making that parent own the decision of where they're sending their kid, how they're educating their kid. It just brings that much more involvement, especially if they actually have to pay for some aspect of that. When you're paying for a service, you value it more. And there's some just really practical aspects of what choice brings to the table outside of even the curriculum and academic performance side of it that just makes a lot of sense in terms of better outcomes.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in some of the questions that I had, because I think this ties into something as far as our work with the Ohio Christian Education Network. And we saw this kind of blow up on Twitter this week about should Christians send their children to a public school or a private school, and what is the responsibility to love your neighbor? Well, what I'm hearing from these numbers is with private schools available in an area, it's helping test scores in the public schools, and it's also providing more options for parents in those schools. So this isn't necessarily a just send your kid to the public school and hope for the best with whatever worldview indoctrination they're getting. This is actually the rising tide that lifts all boats in the area. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And actually, I think, Yitz would have an interesting perspective on this too, because Yitz also works for Agudath Israel, represents the Jewish schools in this. And you guys see this in your community a lot, Yitz, with the ownership families feel with their schools there. Isn't that right?
No, absolutely. And many of those families, they value being able to get a really solid education in an environment that is aligned with their faith. And it's super important. They tend to be highly engaged. Are they highly engaged because that's why they are choosing a private school in the first place? Or is that, the fact that they're investing their time and their money, whether it's through a voucher or out of their pocket, that tends to get people to take more ownership. One of the other things we're just talking about how important some of these programs are. And, I think that there's real value socially, academically, to school choice programs generally. But the reality is I think most people, probably most of the listeners here would probably be surprised to learn that the average amount of taxpayer dollars that's spent in public school is about, I think now it's up to like 13,500. I mean, if you live in a suburban district or some of the other districts, some of them can spend up to $25,000 per student per year. And we're giving these parents vouchers of $6,100 in K through 8 and $8,400 in high school. It saves the taxpayers a lot of money too. I think most people don't realize the amount of money the state invests in public education, and good for them. But long term, these programs have saved the state a lot of money, and that's a good thing too.
Well, and Aaron, that's such a big thing, that the money conversation on this, I feel like is probably the biggest aspect, because I honestly think that's a lot of the driving force behind the teachers union's opposition to this. There's obviously an ideological component maybe we can get to later. But Aaron, could you talk about how for the public schools, choice is actually a great financial win for them in many ways, because they're still, when a kid takes a voucher, they're actually still getting some taxpayer money for a kid they're not educating.
Yeah, that's we could spend all day talking about the financial aspects of public school funding and voucher funding. Voucher funding is obviously pretty simple. As Yitz, Rabbi Frank mentioned, it's $6,100 if you're in K-8 and $8,400 if you're in high school. In public schools, the average district in Ohio receives somewhere around $15,000 per year per pupil. So when you think about, over a child's K-12 journey, the 13 years that are in there, the taxpayers of Ohio, state and local taxpayers, and with some federal support as well, are funding our kids at over $200,000 for their K-12 education, in current dollars. So, there's a lot of, argument and debate over whether we're funding our public schools enough. The critics of private school choice obviously make the argument that we're underfunding public education. The sky is falling. Schools are, underfunded and teachers are underpaid. But, the fact of the matter is that we spend a lot of money on public education. We spend $15,000 per pupil in public schools. In Columbus, it goes up to $18,000, $20,000 in Cleveland and many of our big cities. As Yitz mentioned, some of the suburban districts spend even more than that. So there is a lot of money going in the public school system. Our view is that it is, pretty adequate and sufficient to have that amount of money. If you think about how much $15,000 times 20 kids in a classroom can buy you. So there's a lot of money going into public schools. In terms of, the impacts of private school expansion or private school choice expansion, Troy mentioned a study that Fordham did about a year and a half ago with Dr. Stefan Lavertu at Ohio State, and he did find the positive academic impacts on public schools. And he also showed that there are neutral fiscal effects. There's basically no impact on per pupil spending in public schools when there's growth in enrollment in private school choice programs over the years in Ohio. Part of that is because your local revenues on a per pupil basis actually increase when you have fewer students to educate, because your local revenues are essentially fixed at a local level. The local amount that district generates locally is not based on your enrollments, based on your real estate values and the tax rate. So when you have fewer students, your costs go down, or your expenditures on a per pupil basis actually decrease, because there's same amount of dollars, fewer kids. On a state level, you may see some decrease in state funding when the students leave for an ed choice or a private school or move to a different district. The state does have a number of funding mechanisms that do protect districts when students leave. They're called guarantees. And even when district enrollment is declining, they can still see flat amounts, even if they have declining enrollment. So all those factors told, the impact is neutral from the best empirical research that we have on public schools. Certainly not the story that some people would like to tell about the impacts of the fiscal effects of private school choice.
So, Aaron, does that functionally mean that there are school districts in Ohio today, public school districts, that have less students and adjusted for inflation, they're actually getting more money?
Well, almost all school districts receive more money today than they have in the past. We are spending records amount of funding in public school systems. Part of that is because, like you said, there's been some declines in enrollments, and we almost never cut the budgets of public schools. It almost always goes up every year, year after year, whether you're talking about state revenues, federal revenues, or local revenues.
Just to highlight that a little bit more, if you look at the collective cash reserves of Ohio's school districts, according to the Department of Education and Workforce's latest report, the collective cash reserves total about $9.4 billion. If you compare that to 2012, that number has more than doubled since then. It was just a little bit over $4 billion of cash reserves in 2012. But over that same time period, the last 12 years, the number of Ed Choice recipients has more than tripled. So if the argument that the critics are making that school choice programs are draining financial resources, and you hear the word diversion, it's diverting funds away from public schools quite a bit. If that were true and the number of Ed Choice recipients had tripled, you would expect the financial position of these districts to be more dire and dire over the last decade. But actually, the opposite appears to be true, at least in most cases, because not only has the collective cash reserves more than doubled, but it's doubled in terms relative to their annual expenditures. So, of course, you could say, well, of course, it doubled over 10 years. You have inflation and all that, but it's gone from 20% compared to their expenditures to over 40% compared to their expenditures. So, as you know, just affirming what the study that Aaron referenced is, this is not having any kind of negative financial impact on public school districts.
Well, after covering that financial aspect of it, the other argument that I've heard, and it's at the center of this Ed Choice lawsuit that's going on right now, is this idea that private schools or school choice is actually unconstitutional. It goes against the state constitution in Ohio, which says that the state has an obligation to create a system of common schools. Like, there can only be one. So what's the response to that argument that's being made in the court system right now, that Ed Choice is actually unconstitutional?
Well, I mean, I think that this is actually something that attorneys that are representing the state and the families that would lose their scholarships if this lawsuit were to prevail are arguing, and I think that this is true. The state has a responsibility to provide education for all students in Ohio. And the Constitution sets up a floor, which is we need to have a system. Well, we have a system, and we spend a lot of money on the system. And in addition to that, the legislature decided to create additional options beyond that floor. We have charter schools, we have public STEM schools, we have private schools, and so our view is that what the Constitution provides is a floor, and the legislature went well above that floor and really created options and opportunities for students to access all kinds of different schooling options. And so that's not only, I think, true, but I think that's also a very solid legal argument that, frankly, has been found to be true in many other states that have had similar types of provisions in their constitutions. That's typically how it's been interpreted.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, every student in Ohio should have a public school option. And every Ohio student does have a public school option. Ed Choice is not taking, public schools away from anybody. It's providing additional options for families who want to find a school that meets their kids' needs the best.
And as we consider some of the needs that parents have or consider for their child's education. We hear a lot about the performance of schools, test results, that kind of thing. And it's an objection from the other side as well that not only is school choice dragging down, in their view, the performance of Ohio's schools overall, but that this money is going to send their kids to private schools that actually perform worse than their public schools. And I know this is another case, Troy, of the cherry-picked data that is pretty easily refuted.
Yeah. A common argument that you're going to see in so many of the letters to the editor and, publications that come out against ed choice is data that's pulled from a researcher from Michigan State University named Josh Cowan. And you see his data repeated over and over again in these publications. And one of them that is cited frequently is that 88% of those who use a school choice program end up going to schools that perform worse than the public school that they left. And a couple of responses to that. I will say I have found Josh Cowan to be the ultimate cherry picker of data because he continually makes the claim that there is zero evidence that school choice programs have any benefit. And yet he participated as co-authors of multiple studies that did show academic benefits through school choice programs.
It's a bold move.
So he tends to ignore any type of counter data, and he'll make huge generalizations based off data that he finds favorable to his argument. Now, in the case of this 88% number, that's not even Ohio critics will use that number as if that number was pulled from Ohio research when it largely relied on data from other states, Indiana, Louisiana. But when you look at Ohio specific data, as Aaron referenced in the Fordham study with the Ohio State professor, we actually found this positive effect on students. And so you need to be really careful when you look at data that's being offered. And then a second response to that, I would say, as an educator, and if you were to ask any educator, whether they serve in public schools, private schools, whatever, I think we would all agree that there is more to determining the quality of school than just test scores, right? As a matter of fact, when you look at studies that ask parents, what are the most important components of school quality to you? Test scores are nowhere near the top. Parents value other things. It's not that they're not important. Of course they are important, but they're just one snapshot of how a student is doing, how they're developing as a person. Parents care about other things. They care about things like school safety. They care about things like educational philosophy and worldview development. They care about character development. They care about extracurricular opportunities. What type of friends are my kids going to be able to make at the school? What's the culture of the faculty and staff like? These things are just as important, and they factor into parent satisfaction rate, which I would argue in a lot of ways is a better metric to determine the effect of school choice programs. Are parents who use school choice and live in a school choice system more satisfied with their educational options? And study after study after study has shown not just small improvements in parent satisfaction, but massive double, triple improvements in parent satisfaction. And so I think a lot of what Dr. Cowan and some of the critics are using are they're just pulling out some isolated data and making exaggerated claims based off of it.
I want to, Mike, you brought up the ed choice lawsuit going on. I don't want to get just close to political here for a minute, because this was one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion. We have we have three state Supreme Court justices up for election, seats up for election this November. And, really it's going to determine the future of the program, right? This is one of the many issues that's in state court right now. Actually, as we're recording this right now, House Bill 68, the SAFE Act and Save Women's Sports Act, is being heard in the Court of Appeals. That's going to eventually end up at the state Supreme Court. But so is the ed choice litigation. Yitz, could you give like the big picture of where that's at and really give a picture of what the stakes are in this litigation?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the oral arguments are scheduled for November 4th. And, the judge will rule how she rules, depending on whether or not she finds in favor of the group that's trying to essentially kick 150,000 kids out of their school. It would then be appealed by the state to the appellate court and, if need be, to the Supreme Court. And certainly, like, judges are powerful. If the decision goes the wrong way, it's very, very important that the appellate court and the Supreme Court, keep that program intact. Again, we think the law is on our side, but judges sometimes do some legislating from the bench, and we definitely don't want that to happen here. But part of me feels like also, our arguments are strong. Our legal arguments are strong. I think it's telling that the group that brought this lawsuit, frankly, was not joined by the typical public school establishment groups. Whatever the reason for that is, it may be that they believe it's a loser of a lawsuit, or they don't want to get blamed for throwing 150,000 kids out of their school. But, the other thing is also, if you look into what they're arguing, they make this like disingenuous claim that, well, we're just going after this program and charter schools are fine, or the Cleveland Scholarship Program we're not going to touch that, or the 10,000 kids that receive Ohio special needs scholarships are fine. If they were to win, that would mean that those programs are on life support too, because whatever the judge would find, they would have to ultimately end up striking those down. I don't think judges are going to do that. I don't think that there's a judge in this country, whether there's a D next to their name or an R next to their name, or they're a communist, I don't really care what they are, that wants to go and throw 150,000 kids out of school. So I think at some point we're going to find a judge in somewhere, whether it's hopefully at the common pleas level, but if not at the appellate level and the Supreme Court level, that will uphold the rights of these families to choose these schools. I mean, part of me, though, like as an advocate, kind of like feels like it would be kind of fun. Like if they strike those down, can you imagine like what would happen if hundreds of thousands of parents, kids got kicked out of school? Can you imagine the pressure the legislature and the governor would be under to find a solution to this? And so that's why I think that really all that's happening here is that this group is wasting taxpayer dollars, because taxpayers are
I was going to say, that's the
lawsuit.
big part of this thing to me. That's the craziest
School
aspect.
districts,
You can undo that. Yeah, unpack that.
Yeah, school districts are taking money that your listeners are paying them through their property taxes and income taxes, and then giving it to this group to sue the state to kick your own kids out of school, which is just insane. But maybe we could come up with a legislative solution for that. Stay tuned.
Yeah, no, it's taxpayer entities state entities suing the state to get state money for them. It's just the most incestuous, and meanwhile, some outside law firm that's profiting on all of it. I mean, it's the most insane. When you actually graph it out, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, and luckily, look, I mean, the Attorney General, Dave Yost, his legal team has been doing a great job. And then the Institute for Justice, right, who has argued similar cases in Supreme Court around the country, including the United States Supreme Court, and won multiple times, are representing the families, the 5 families that stepped up and were willing to engage directly in this litigation. So I feel really confident about it. That being said, it's super important that people need to know who their judges are, right? Like they need to know that, because they have an enormous amount of power, particularly in this case. So
the other aspect, though, we were talking about some of the reasons why the teachers unions oppose school choice, and there's obviously the financial side we got to, but there is an ideological side of this that I think we have to acknowledge, and one of the things we always like around CCV, our favorite daily emails we get is the daily Bill Phyllis Ohio ENA email, and I think at one point or another, all of us, save for Mike, have been mentioned in this email. I do think, though, Yitz, I think School Choice Ohio carries the title still of most mentions in there. Fordham's up there. Buckeye might be, I think, is the closest behind you, though, Yitz. But you guys,
Fordham ranks. Fordham ranks pretty high on the list. I'm not, your listeners can't see this, but I actually have one of those emails printed out and framed on my wall. I think the title of the email is "Not to be outdone by voucher zealots in the legislature, the governor gives a super boost to the voucher industry in his state budget proposal." So that is a badge of honor. That
a super boost. I like that.
A super boost. And yes, there are 150,000 kids now in Ohio exercising school choice. And I feel like we've done a good job in Ohio of funding our public schools, increasing it every year. Inflation adjusted, our spending is way up. Despite the fact, by the way, that our population of school-aged students in Ohio has declined by over 10% in the past 15 years. So we're spending more money for a declining population. I think the legislature's demonstrated that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. One other thing I just thought I'd mention, going back to the lawsuit, maybe I shouldn't say this publicly. I guess we will. I guess the oral arguments are soon enough. The legislature funds public schools pretty well. And the way it does it, we have a little bit of, we try to make sure that poorer districts get more money from the state because those kids still matter. We need to make sure that they're educated and they may be less able to take care of themselves. And we try to fund things on a per student basis. If the courts tomorrow were to say that vouchers or a choice scholarship program is unconstitutional and no more, those districts wouldn't get a single penny more. And that really is completely undermines their argument. What they are asking the court to give them, they can't even give because that's just not how school funding works. So they just don't understand this at all.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I actually, I'm going to divert from where I was going because I do want to get to something Yitz just said. I'm going to come back to this email I've got up from the teachers unions from last year, but it's a common thing they come back to. But I want to go, Aaron, real quick. Yitz just brought something up about how these school districts, we're spending more money even though we have less school-aged children. I think for a lot of us, when the news came out in Columbus that they were closing 9 public schools, and of course, along with their announcement that they were closing 9 public school buildings, also came the news that at their press conference they said, "But we're not going to lay anyone off because I still don't understand how that actually works." But they made a comment that we had about 42,000 kids in Columbus Public. And you might not know the answer to this question in particular, but that surprised me because they said, in the 1970s, we had around 112,000, 117,000, something like that in the city of Columbus. Meanwhile, everyone's seen all of the stories about how much Columbus is booming, is growing, right? I think we're now the 14th largest city in the country. How is that happening? There's obviously a question of why is that happening, but what's happened that has, you've seen the population of Columbus grow so much, but Columbus City Schools has really shrank.
Yeah, I think, going back a decade, I wasn't there in the 70s to see the true boom of Columbus City Schools when they had 100,000 kids. But they had about 50,000 kids just, a decade ago. And so that's put some pressure in terms of, their facilities footprint. And we've seen a lot of stories about under-enrolled buildings. Cleveland and Northeast Ohio have probably seen that the most over the last couple of decades, where they've really seen a lot of enrollment declines. And they have had school closures. And some of it's demographics. A lot of it is demographics. I think a lot of population boom in Central Ohio is in the suburbs too. A lot of the suburban districts are growing. So Olentangy, New Albany, Plain, those districts are growing crazy. And they should get more support from the state, or if they need to raise local taxes to support more students. When you have declining enrollments, like places in Columbus or Cleveland, Youngstown, those type of urban communities where there has been demographic changes, and there has been more school choice over the past few years in some of these urban districts. School choice has historically primarily been an urban initiative. That is changing, obviously, with some of the changes with the scholarship program. But historically, cities like Cleveland, Columbus have had the most school choice options, and wisely so, because the schools there have struggled the most. The public school systems have had the most problems and been the most dysfunctional. So there are some changes happening on the public school side that happen when you have demographic changes, or you bring in school choice and more options for families. It does require, some downsizing of the budgets for schools, but on a per pupil basis, which is, I think, the most important aspect of funding. How many dollars are there to serve each individual child? You don't see the impact. But in terms of what happens, at a budget level, in terms of raw numbers, I mean, you will need to have some adjustments on the public school system when you lose students and you lose some of that revenue. But on a per student basis, that remains neutral. And that's really what matters, because we care about funding kids. To use a cliche, we care about funding kids, not systems. We care about, how many resources are available for each individual child to meet their needs. And that obviously includes kids in private, public charter, and public schools as well.
Yeah, when you talk about per pupil revenue, and I agree with Aaron, that's actually the most important consideration. When a district loses students to a school choice program, it's more than likely that their per pupil revenue could even increase, because the local revenue is fixed. And so the district continues to get 100% of their local revenue, even if enrollment dropped down to one, in an extreme case, into one student. And so you can see how that has a positive impact on their per pupil revenue. So the state portion, and maybe even some of their federal portion, is contingent on their enrollment, but their local portion is not. And so I think the question came earlier as, why are student academic performances improving in the public schools as a result of school choice? I think this is one of the reasons. They have fewer students and the same amount or even more per pupil revenue to invest in their programs.
So I want to go back to the conversation here about this Bill Phillips email I have, because I do think it ties a lot into what you look at all the conversation we're having here about. It just doesn't make sense why folks would oppose these programs. But there's a line of thinking to understand the mindset of these teachers unions that I think is really important. This is an email actually from about a year ago, but it's something that Bill Phillips writes a lot about. He writes, "Vouchers segregate the social order into enclaves of various economic, racial, ethnic, religious, societal, political, and cultural groups." I should mention Bill Phillips is not the world's best writer of prose, and we'll talk about some of these things in particular. But the framers of the Ohio Constitution in 1850 and 1851 understood the interdependency of common school and democracy, and thus the importance of all of the children, of all of the people to be educated together on common ground. The idea here that the teachers unions and Bill Phillips and a lot of these folks advocate for is they don't like the idea that you have children getting different perspectives. They want all the children coming into one place and getting the same perspective on the world, right? And this is, again, I would say the same indoctrination. They don't like that children can go to a different school and be told that they were fearfully and wonderfully made, right? Be told that maybe there was a creator of the universe, something like that, right? Not get the evolution message pushed on them all the time. Be told that marriage is something beautiful between a man and a woman, or whatever else we could say. There's a real ideology here from these teachers unions saying, no, we want the kids all coming to one place, which is so funny. From the people that push diversity, They want sort of a singularity of thought of our children in America and in Ohio in particular. Now, one of the things that really makes me laugh about this, though, Aaron, is something that you guys at Fordham have been debunking for a while, that school choice programs actually segregate schools. This is something they say all the time, that school choice programs segregate schools. But actually, we do see segregation. We do see redlining happening in Ohio, but it's not through private schools. Isn't that right?
No, that's right. I mean, I think there is some sort of rosy kind of lens or whatever the phrase is that some of the critics like to think of their public schools as. But if you look at the public school system, and you look at a map of Columbus, you'll see the city of Columbus where a lot of the students in our urban area attend, and then you'll see a bunch of suburban districts. And the only way you can go to a suburban district in Ohio, in most places, is to buy a house there, and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in property taxes. And so there are some suburban districts that do have inter-district open enrollment and allow students outside of their boundaries to attend their schools. It happens a lot more in the rural and small town areas. But if you look around our cities, they're quite segregated by socioeconomic status, where the students in Columbus, if you live in inner city Columbus, you cannot attend a public school in the suburbs. You can't go to Bexley. You can't go to Upper Arlington. That's the way the public system works. You get assigned a school and you go to that school. That's your option for public schools. So we'd like to see, obviously, over the years, the legislature, to its credit, has expanded the options through charter schools and vouchers, and there is inter-district open enrollment. But for a number of kids, if there were no charter schools or no voucher programs, you would be locked into a single public school that may or may not be good for your child.
Well, as we start to wind up our conversation here, just for our listeners, I know we've thrown a lot at them today, and we've had some really solid numbers that we've presented. I want to give them something that they can kind of base their arguments on, as we say, well, the other side's cherry picking data, and they might make the same claim about us. So what could we do to encourage people who want to stand up and advocate for school choice to know that some of the things that we're talking about today really are founded on good data? And Aaron, I'll give you first crack at this question, if you don't mind.
Ooh, I think the most common claim you hear argument against private school choice is that it drains money, and it's the financial arguments that the critics like to latch onto most. And I think the response is that, as Yitz mentioned, we as a state in Ohio can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can provide more options for families who want them for their own kids. We can support that. We can even support that financially through the voucher programs, through funding public charter schools, joint vocational school districts, all kinds of choices, and give kids the options that best meet their needs. And we can also fund great public schools too. And we can make sure that our public schools are as good as they can be, and the kids learn as much as they possibly can, and have great opportunities when they exit our K-12 education. So I think, that ability to, again, walk and chew gum at the same time, we can do both. It's not a zero-sum game.
And Yitz, I'd just love to kind of get your take as we look toward the future of, what kind of things should we be looking for from the state legislature as we look to maybe expand or defend school choice in the state of Ohio?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we've got a state budget coming up, and as always, there will be lots of different groups and people that want the legislature to do different things. I think that the main thing that folks like us who are advocates and your listeners who are probably pretty politically engaged, the main thing to keep in mind is we don't get to make these types of decisions, right? We get to educate. We get to encourage. We can sometimes mobilize folks that think along the lines that we do, that maybe have the same values and are supportive of improving education through school choice. But the thing to remember is the legislators get to decide these things. And so I think that the most important thing that your listeners could do is certainly familiarize yourself with the data, But you know what? It's not necessarily your job to know the data. If you support school choice because of how it, for whatever your reason is, whether it's based on your values, whether you think it improves academics, or it saves the state money, or it's just the right thing to do to let parents to make their own choices for their kid, you need to let your legislators know that, and you should get to know them, and you should make sure that they know that you care about this and that you're watching it, because those are the people, along with the governor, obviously, that ultimately get to make these decisions. And it's really important that they hear from their constituents of how they feel about this.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and gentlemen, just want to thank the three of you for sitting in with us today. Yitz, Aaron, Troy, appreciate your expertise, and I know this is going to be a valuable resource for our listeners, and thank you so much for joining the Narrative Podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.